Michael Abramowitz, President of Freedom House, welcome to HFX 2020.
Thank you for having me, Robin.
It's always a pleasure, Mike, and it's a pity we can't be meeting in person in Nova Scotia. I know you have some contacts. Is it family up in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, my family has a place in Cape Breton, and I've wanted to get there for a long time in the last year, but sadly the border has been closed. So hopefully this summer.
Yeah, well, next year in Cape Breton, next year in Halifax, eh?
Absolutely.
Um, Mike, I wanted to come first of all. It makes sense if we're looking at remaking the democratic world order to look at the most influential democracy in the contemporary world, which is, of course, the United States of America. There's just been, obviously, an election here. You're in touch with your people throughout the world. You're also in touch with other rights organizations throughout the world. How are people evaluating what's going on in the United States right now?
Well, I think people are concerned. I think the United States, for better or for worse, has historically been a beacon, if you will, for democracy and freedom. Not to say that we always do things perfectly, and we're occasionally an imperfect tribune, and we've made serious mistakes. But I think the reality is that people do look at the United States for leadership around the issues that we care about: the promotion of liberty, the promotion of freedom, the promotion of democracy. And I think right now we're in a phase where the United States is something of a tarnished tribune. I think, for instance, of a lot of comments I'm getting from colleagues and others from around the world about the refusal of the president to accept the election results, which really is crucial to democracy. The idea of having a peaceful transfer of power. And I guarantee you that authoritarians around the world, whether it's Maduro in Venezuela, Lukashenko in Belarus, are watching to see how we've handled the election here, and it's a sad situation.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, we would want the losing party to immediately volunteer that they have in fact lost. And yet, one of the great things about the United States of America is that the framers built your Constitution with difficult and awkward customers in mind, didn't they? And so, in a certain sense, I wonder whether when we get out of this, presuming we get out of this in the manner that we expect to, that Joe Biden is inaugurated on January the 20th of next year, in a certain sense, we could celebrate the importance of institutions in human rights. I mean, nobody's ever thought that, politicians were perfect people, and therefore the framers decided to create something that would allow for the vicissitudes of human nature. Is that something that perhaps, it might be working a little bit too hard right now, but at a certain point we might come through this with American democracy looking actually stronger?
Well, I certainly agree with you that there's a lot to celebrate about what just happened 2 weeks ago in my country. We had some of the greatest voter turnout in our history, right? Roughly 145 million people or so who voted, which is incredible. The election, from everything I can tell, was handled fairly competently and with smoothness by the state election administrators, as far as I can tell. And we had comments from the Department of DHS. We've had a confirmation that there was it was done without a lot of interference by foreign powers. So there's really a lot to celebrate, I think, in terms of what happened 2 weeks ago. And I think that's an important reminder, Robin. And so I think that we've been through a period in which I think there's greater deal of reflection that I've experienced in quite some time. I'm a former journalist, and after that, I worked at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. But there's been a great deal of reflection, I think, about how to revitalize our democracy. I think we've seen an incredible outpouring, for instance, of civil society in our country, protests, people trying to hold government to account, and that's to be celebrated. And so I do hope that in the long term, this period will be one in which our democracy does emerge more solid and stronger than ever. I mean, America is very unique, I think, in the world because we have a capacity for self-correction. We make mistakes, but then we learn from the mistakes and we do better in the future.
moving from the United States itself and democracy in the United States to democracy around the world, obviously many layers on which to discuss that issue, but let's, as it were, start at the top in terms of the international institutions that govern the world today. The United Nations Human Rights Council is, to put it mildly, a difficult beast to deal with, isn't it? And with China making very strong inroads into all sorts of international institutions and appearing more often than perhaps you and I would like to get its way in institutions like that, what can we actually do to reform international institutions, particularly those dealing with human rights, in such a way that the global public actually looks up to them rather than looking down on them and feeling somewhat concerned about the way these people are behaving?
Well, I think the first thing, Robin, that we have to do is to re-engage with some of these institutions. I think about places like the Human Rights Council, and that is a deeply flawed institution. And the fact that some of the most egregious human rights violators in the world have significant roles on that is a problem. That said, Saudi Arabia failed in its effort to get on the Human Rights Council this year. And I think that if the United States under President-elect Biden chooses to re-engage with the Human Rights Council and to try to really fight for our basic principles and to fight for our values, then I think that will really go a long way to beginning to address this issue. We may need some other institutions. I'm not sure about that. There are a lot of ideas that have been thrown out. For instance, the vice president has said he wants to have a summit of democracies. We'll see what he means by that. But I think the first thing you want to do is actually engage with the institutions you have. And the United States has been on kind of the United States has a justifiable critiques of the Human Rights Council. I think anyone who's watched what's happened there would see that it's deeply flawed and puts excessive focus on democratic countries and not on the authoritarians that are violating human rights. So I agree with all that. But I think one answer to that is engagement.
Just take it a step further. It's interesting. I mean, obviously, it's very easy to look, and it's the right thing to do, to look at these rather egregious violations of human rights being perpetrated through the United Nations Human Rights Council. What actually does the Human Rights Council do that is positive? I mean, is it, we look at these institutions, and if you say, one way of looking at it, the value of any institution is simply to say, well, try and imagine a world where it didn't exist at all. Would the world be a worse place from a human rights point of view if simply we just said, look, it's a multilateral institution, that means dictatorships are involved in it. You're actually going to be better off if you just don't go through this charade. Or are we missing something? For all the problems, are there some benefits that the world gets from institutions like the United Nations Human Rights Council?
Well, I certainly think that there's not a single magic bullet that the Human Rights Council can provide to solve the problem of human rights in the world. But at its best, institutions like the Human Rights Council and other UN institutions can really cast a light on severe problems in the world. I think, for instance, several years ago, of the special report that had been done by the Australian jurist, Mr. Kirby, that really looked for the first time at the slave labor camps and the extent of that gulag, if you will, in North Korea. And that was, to me, where you really saw the value of these kinds of international institutions, where working through the mechanism of the UN, he was able to cast a light on a problem that had really got insufficient attention from the world in terms of human rights abuses. So I do believe that these institutions can be reformed and improved. They're never going to be perfect, because when you're in a world in which you're living with authoritarian powers and it's a multilateral world, you have to make accommodations. But I think the only way that we can move forward is by zealously advocating for our values with these institutions.
Looking a little more broadly inside the United Nations, and we'll happily talk about other international institutions as well, but there's the Human Rights Council, which obviously is a human rights organization you're going to be very interested in on a day-to-day level. What sort of relationship does Freedom House have with the Secretary General, with other institutions in the United Nations? I'm just interested because, I think often it's easy to miss how other parts of the global governance system can be impacted by organizations such as Freedom House?
Right. Well, we have a presence with some of these with some of these institutions. I would say that we're a relatively modest sized institution on a global scale. We've spent a lot of our advocacy efforts over the last 3 or 4 years really focused on the U.S. Congress, on the executive branch of the U.S. government. We feel that that's been an area where there's a lot of work to do and where we have a certain influence, because I think people respect Freedom House on a nonpartisan and even bipartisan basis. But we consult with the UN bodies, and over the years we've weighed in on issues like Venezuela, China, and issues like that.
Right. I mean, absolutely. And all of these things. I mean, even just putting a word in the ear of the right people can make a serious difference. I wonder when it comes to, I mean, if we're looking at remaking the democratic world order, the issue of international law is obviously a central part of that. From a human rights perspective, what do you think needs to be done that isn't currently being done in terms of international law? What would you must be having conversations all the time with your colleagues that, well, if only we had this, we could make a difference. What is it that really you would like to see that isn't happening right now in terms of global governance and human rights and international law?
Well, that's a vast question, Robin. I think what I would say is that I think we have to return to kind of a rules-based, law-based view of human rights and of kind of universality, that we are all accountable to that body of law. And one of the things, for instance, that I was disturbed about was the U.S. treatment of the International Criminal Court over the last four years. Now, I used to work at the Holocaust Museum. I worked there on issues of mass atrocity and genocide. And again, the International Criminal Court, like the Human Rights Council, is an imperfect institution, and one can question their some of their decisions and some of their prosecutorial initiatives. But at the end of the day, we need to cooperate. And the idea of preventing their people from coming to the United States, or threatening arrests, or the kinds of measures that the State Department has done, I think that's disturbing. And so I think we have to get back to kind of a basic respect for international law, understanding that different countries are going to make different decisions based on their own sovereign decisions, but that we all have to be held accountable to the same body of law.
Mike, thank you very much. That was terrific, and it's so good to have the voice of Freedom House at Halifax International Security Forum and HFX generally. We're really appreciative. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Really enjoyed it too, Robin. Thank you.
Thanks.